Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So this is going to be a recommendation for the black pieces against the Jobava London system. First off, I'm going to explain the basics of this opening, what the lines are that I'm going to recommend, and I'm going to show you two games of mine that I've played recently against the Jobava London, as well as some additional lines with the help of the engine that I think are really important to know. So yeah, recently this has gained a lot of popularity because of Daniel Naroditsky, recommending this, this being one of his main openings actually. And yeah, I do think that black is more than fine actually, and I'm very comfortable in these positions. I don't think that white has a lot, honestly, but it's very new, and in that sense it's a surprise weapon that many people I don't think will go on studying, and so people I think will underestimate it and will get a bad position quickly. And so with this video I think that I will be able to cover all of the important lines that will enable you to beat the Jobava London most of the time. So yeah, we get to the main opening position after d4, and it depends if you want to play knight f6 or d5. But the point is that white will play this move knight c3 on the second move, no matter what. And this is actually a suspicious move because it blocks first off the c-pawn from being able to move forward. So unlike the Queen's Gambit decline, which immediately challenges black center, knight c3 does not do that and removes a lot of the dynamics with the c-pawn in this opening. But they can later move the knight away, for example, to b5 and eventually push c3 or c4. So it's not, it's a big deal, but it's not the end of the world. And from this position, it's interesting because if you yourself are a French player, then you may just play the move e6 here and not waste any time into studying the theory against the Jobava London, because after e6, this is an invitation to the French. And white essentially cannot force the Jobava London with bishop f4 because we don't need to play knight f6. We can also play this move bishop d6, which is completely fine for black. Black will simply play maybe a6 and c5 next, for example. I see nothing wrong with this. Yeah, I'm not sure if anything's wrong with the a6 here, but it doesn't seem to be as far as I can see. Maybe queen g4, but I'm not really afraid of that. Yeah, but essentially the principled move is knight f6, and this is the way to punish the Jobava London. After bishop f4, white is possibly converging on the c7 square, but the idea is, for example, after e6, white has two systems. They can play this move e3, which was recommended originally by GingerGM in his course on the Jobava London. This was a long time ago, but this was like the first, I think, one of the first, if not the first, resource on the Jobava London itself, which I think after bishop b4, black is doing very well, if not is already better. I actually prefer black's position after bishop b4. But secondly is this move knight b5, which has been recommended by Hans Niemann in his Chessable course and Daniel Naroditsky, as well as Alexander Bortnyk's course on the Jobava London. Very recent release, which I've bought myself. And after knight b5 here, the idea is to converge on this c7 square and force this move knight a6, which defends the c7 square but misplaces the knight. However, notice that even though our knight is misplaced, this knight has gone from c3 to b5, and it will later be kicked with c6. And so this knight has also wasted a lot of time. And so in that sense, this knight on a6 is not that big of a deal. Because we will be able to reroute it eventually to, for example, c6 via b8 or even via b4 sometimes. And the main line goes something like e3, and black will want to complete the development first before thinking of kicking this knight out. After c6, after bishop e7, sorry, white can play knight f3, and black will simply castle and think about c6 followed by c5 next, or even after h4, which was recommended by Naroditsky's and Bortnyk's course. We will play this move c6. After knight c3, queen a5. And I think this is the most testing variation by far against this mainline Jobava London. And black has, or rather white has two moves, bishop e2 or bishop d3. Bishop e2 was recommended in their course. after which we will release the shocker bishop a3, which I think equalizes for black quite nicely, and black and white will have to know some things to not get into worse position. And this move is actually not covered in their course, so I think it's a shocker for most people who even bought their course. So yeah. Besides that, for example, after queen a5, if they play the move bishop d3, which prevents the move knight e4, the c5 move is very nice, threatening the possibility of c4, but also allowing this knight to come back to c6 via b4. First off, harassing the bishop and also giving the c6 square. So that's quite a nice variation, I think. And yeah, so we will get right into the theory. First off, with the main line that was recommended by Naroditsky. So after d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, bishop f4, and e6 here. So we don't really need to prevent this move knight b5, because as we saw, the knight wastes a lot of time going to c3 and the b5, and then we're going to kick it back, so it's going to waste a lot of time. But if we play this move a6 here, one variation that I want to avoid is after e3, e6, this move g4, which was recommended by Hans Niemann, and I don't really want to get into this because white immediately starts an attack, and you need to know some precise moves to counter this. And so what I want to do is play the move e6, and after knight b5, play this move knight a6, as we saw before. And now we're covering the c7 square, and we simply want to play bishop e7 and castles first, before playing c6 and kicking the knight back. So after e3, bishop e7, knight f3, and castles, the recommendation in their course was h4. But I've seen this move knight e5 played a lot of, quite a few times. First off by Bortnyk, and he managed to beat Caruana in this variation in Title Tuesday. And it's actually important that you need to know that in this variation we do not play this move c5 at all. And here we simply first off kick the knight with c6, the knight retreats back to c3, and now this move queen a5. Now the reason we don't want to play c5 is that this becomes a big mess after bishop a6, ba6, and knight c6. Now this attacks both pieces, and after, let's say, queen e8, they trade it here, and d takes c5. And now this move is very annoying because white gets to get a lot of control over the center with this move queen d4. And if we exchange here, we're simply left with a bad pawn structure, a bad bishop on c8 here, closed off by its own pawns. The b file can't even be used by the rook because the bishop on f4 is quite annoying. And so this variation is just very good for white. And so instead of c5 here, we want to play this move queen a5. Now, again, important here is not to play the move queen b6, which I've tried a few times, but actually white can play this move rook b1, first off defending the pawn, and if we play c5, let's say bishop e2 here, and knight b8, trying to reroute the knight to c6, white can castle and have the additional options of playing the move knight e4, which wasn't really possible before. For example, after bishop d7, this move g4 is also quite annoying, and I just want to demonstrate a line here. Against this move g4, we typically want to give the knight some space on d7 so that after g5 hits, our knight can retreat to d7 and challenge the knight on e5, which is nicely centralized. And so after bishop e8, a thematic move, let's just follow this line, which demonstrates why I don't really recommend this. g5, knight of d7, knight a4. And now this forces an exchange on c5, which isn't really favorable for black. Let's say after queen d8, takes, bishop d3, white really gets all of the pieces active here. And even the computer recommends this move f5, which really weakens the structure. Knight c6, bc6, bishop g5, queen f7, let's say after b4, kicking the bishop back, and f4, white has a lot of dangerous initiative, and black has to find some only moves. For example, in this position, if you want to pause the video and try to find the best move for black, and actually the only move to maintain equality, then do pause your video. But actually the move is very surprising. It's queen d7, which I haven't really delved into. After I saw this move being recommended, I don't really want to allow this in the first place. And so, yeah, essentially, this is the variation that I want to avoid. So queen b6 is not really the best move. Queen a5 here, on the other hand, has the possibility of threatening knight e4, as well as support this move c5, without running into any issues with knight a4 in the future. So after bishop d3, c5 here is really nice. And typically, yeah, white wants to take on c5 here, because if they ignore it, let's say with a move like g4, then we can close down the position with c4, making this bishop very passive. And so the best line here is after g5, we take on d3, g takes f6, we play an intermezzo here, attacking the queen, and now they can play queen h5, which looks quite dangerous. But actually, the nice thing of the queen being on a5 here is that it can quickly come back to d8 to defend the king side. So after bishop f6, knight g4, it looks quite dangerous here. But we have this move queen d8, which consolidates everything. And let's say rook g1, trying to attack, we play g6. And now if they play a move like queen h6, then we simply preserve the dark squared bishop with good defense here. And so they typically should, white definitely should take on f6, queen takes f6, and seeing that this is a pin, there's a pin on the g-pawn, there's no reason to move this queen away. White can play the move king d2, trying to win back the pawn, but after bishop d7, queen h6, now with a serious threat of bishop e5, we can play the move queen e7, prepared to meet bishop e5 with f6. And so h4 here really tries to intensify the pressure, but we again play f6. Now it's important to note that we can close the position. For example, if white plays move h5, we can play g5, closing the position. And we're ready to play queen g7 next to trade off the queens. And the sacrifice here doesn't really work, because we simply play king h8, the white king is also exposed. We can even just trade off the rooks after, let's say this. Yeah, no problems at all. And so h5 is not really good. They should try to intensify the pressure here by doubling up. But now we play the move queen g7, and let's say h5. Now we have this very important move king f7. And I think after this, white essentially has nothing. Because we cannot take on, we cannot play g5 here, because now bishop takes g5 actually is a serious problem with the pressure on the g-file. And so king f7 here is important to defend the g6 square. And after hg6, if we trade off the queens and play something like rook h8, we'll be more than fine here. And so queen h3 tries to preserve the queens on the board, but now we take over the h-file, queen f3, and after king e8, I don't think black has any serious problems at all. Black is doing very well here. And they're also up to pawns, so white is the one that needs to prove the compensation. If we play a move like g5 here at the right time, then I don't see any problems with black's position. So yeah, that essentially covers this move, g4. And instead of that, they should definitely take on c5 here, but after knight takes c5 and let's say castles, black can once again play this move bishop castles, and then play this move bishop d7, just so that they're ready to cover some of the light squares on the queen side. And also, in case of g4, they can also just play bishop e8, for example, ready to meet g5 with knight of d7. And we saw that there are no serious problems in that variation. So, yeah, and the last variation here is after castles. After castles. Let's say after castles here, I do like this move knight b4, which shows one of the ideas behind this move c5 is to allow this knight to come back to c6. So if they play the move a3 here, now we can take the bishop off the board. Let's say knight takes d3, and now without the bishop on the board eyeing down black's king, we can now take on d4, e takes d4, and play bishop d7 with a completely fine position. Now one of the rooks can make use of the c-file, and we see that this knight on c3 is really misplaced because it removes the possibility of c4. And so we see that in the long term, this knight is a problem. Maybe in the short term it looks okay, add some additional dynamics with knight b5 stuff, but in the long term we can put some pressure on the c-file here. Let's say after knight e5, centralizing the knight once again, rook f8, rook e1, and we see this typical move bishop e8. We essentially can start pushing the pawn on the queen side, for example b5, retreat the queen back to d8, and push a5 to push b4, and eventually go for this kind of minority attack. After, for example, rook e3, trying to generate a kingside attack. Queen d8 is nice, also adding defense to the king side, rook h3, and b5. And simply, black's counterplay is really fast here. White has no attack. So yeah, it's also possible here to play the move c4. For example, instead of knight b4, to play the move c4, shutting down the bishop. But I think that this knight b4 move really solves the big issue in black's position, which is the knight on a6. And if they retreat with bishop e2 here, which was played by Bortnyk twice on chess.com, we can retreat the knight back to c6. And a3 was played in both of those games. And actually, black has two options here, two good options. They can first off take on d4, and after, let's say, c takes d4, e takes d4, and play bishop d7. Yeah, black can simply make use of the c file here with rook f c8, retreat the queen back to d8 or even b6 to put some pressure on the b2 pawn and d4 square. And yeah, consolidate everything, making use of the pressure on the c file with some good counterplay. That's the first option. Second option is to take on e5 here, forcing bishop takes e5, and then playing this move a6. So this move a6 really cuts down the possibility of knight b5 from coming. And yeah, black can also think about pushing c4 next, and then pushing b5 possibly, bishop b7, things like that. Sticking a knight on e4, for example, gives a lot of space on the queen side. And yeah, a6 is the best move for sure. Instead, if we play a move like bishop d7, which is very careless, we need to be careful of this queen eyeing down the bishop here, actually, because white has a lot of counterplay with the possibility of pushing e4. For example, dc5, queen c5, and e4 here makes use of the bishop on d7 being quite loose. And I think white is already better in this position. And so a6 here is a nice waiting move, a nice useful move here. Yeah, and after, let's say, dc5, queen c5, bishop d3, lining the bishop onto the king side. Knight e8 here is nice to consolidate the position, possibly with bishop d6 next to challenge the bishop on e5. And after queen f3, we can challenge the bishop with bishop d6, and queen h3 here can be met nicely with the move f5. And so after this move f5, so we need to know when it's actually okay to play f5 and when it's actually super weakening. And in this kind of structure, if white is able to chip down the center with the move like c4 and take on d5, leaving us with a backward e-pawn, and if we take on d5 with the e-pawn, then we will be left with an isolated queen's pawn, which is not desirable. But in this specific position, note how the knight is on c3, which blocks the c-pawn from advancing. And so, because of this specific fact, it makes it really difficult for white to undermine our f5 move. And so this structure is quite solid. For example, after queen g3, we can simply develop with bishop d7. We don't want to allow the queen to centralize for free, and so bishop d7, at least not now, bishop d7, knight e2 is very logical to prepare c4, maybe with rook fc1, c4. But here now we will take on e5, play our rook to c8 here, covering the c4 square more. After knight d4, putting some pressure on on e6, we can play knight f6 here, making use of the fact that this is not free because of the possibility of queen e7 and rook e8, making use of the queen being undefended. And so h3 here is a useful move. And so queen c7, we prepare to trade off the queens. And if we trade off the queens, then we will be left with quite an impressive center. So knight f3, rook fe8, rook fc1, and now we will simply improve the position. We will play king f8 here, preparing king e7. So after c4, trying to blast open the position. Now and only now do we trade off the queens and play king e7 so that our bishop is quite nicely defended. After let's say they take our bishop to move the bishop in the endgame, which is quite a valuable asset. I think that this endgame is quite nice for black, or quite holdable for black essentially. And here it's important to actually trade off one pair of rooks, because if we leave both pairs of rooks on the board, then white can try to exert some pressure here, maybe looking for e4 in the future. But once we trade off the one pair of rooks, then the danger is really there really is no danger essentially. Let's say after king f1, we can expand to b5, g4, g6, and with the rook coming to b8 and king coming to d6, there are no infiltration squares for the white rook. And so I think This is just a completely equal endgame. So yeah, I do have to admit that white has the bishop, but in the endgame, which is something preferable, but it's not much at all. And instead of, I think we already covered this variation with queen a5 and bishop d3. So in this variation, we've covered knight e5. So next is this move h4, which is what was recommended in their course, after which we can play c6. So similar, exactly the same as the other variation. And for knight c3, here I recommend the move, again, queen a5. So we saw c6 and queen a5 being thematic in both variations. Now, the reason that I don't want to play the move c5 now is that white can play the move h5. And if we were forced to play h6, then white can play this move g4, which is quite annoying. Let's say we have to prevent this move g5 from blasting open our king side. We have to play like knight h7, but after bishop d3, moves like bishop takes h7 become really like strong. For example, c4 here shuts down the bishop, and so this forces bishop takes h7 after king h7 and a3, preventing the knight from using the square. Bishop d7 just developing, and now rook g1 preparing g5, and so this essentially forces f6, which covers the g5 square, and so g5 is never possible now, unless maybe white spends a lot of time into investing this move f4. But I don't want to do this because this really weakens the g6 square. So I think this variation is playable for black, but it's not really what we want to go for, because first off, black does gain a lot of counterplay with the queen side push of b5, b4, but we create a lot of weaknesses on the king side. And so if it's by principle, I don't want to recommend this variation. And yeah, essentially, if we have to notice that once we play this move h6, our move f6 is not really possible. And I think that f6 is more desirable than h6, because f6 also has the additional benefit of covering this move knight e5. And so I think f6 is the move that we want to play if we want to, shut down the attack. But playing it in combination with h6 is not really desirable. And so yeah, essentially after this move h4, I do recommend this move c6, knight c3, and queen a5. And now there are two moves here. Most commonly played and most logical is to stick the bishop on d3. But bishop e2 was recommended in their course, and after which they've only covered this move knight e4, after which I think with perfect play, white gets a lot of counterplay. For example, castles, knight c3, bc3, queen takes c3, and h5. And so here, for example, it's important not to play h6 because white can stick a knight on e5, and we don't really want to play f6 because this weakens the g6 square and all the light squares. And so after knight c7, rook b1, white just has a lot of play. Our bishop on c8 is just bad, and I think white will win most of these games. Despite the evaluation being just only slightly better for white. But instead, if you play f6 here, which is quite possible, the position gets quite murky after rook b1, knight b4. A3 here is a nice deflection. Queen takes a3. This is one of the lines given by the computer. Queen d2, queen a5, c3, knight a6, and after queen c2, we can see that this very clever maneuver of bringing the bishop to d3 really provokes a lot of weaknesses on, especially like this h7 pawn, and so this position becomes unclear, which is why I don't want to play this move knight e4. But this move bishop a3 is a big shocker, and now they have to actually take this pawn, take this bishop. If they play a move like queen b1 here, then actually we can play queen b4, and now there's no way to defend b2, so they have to take on a3. And after queen takes c3, this is basically the exact same variation as taking the bishop immediately, but now the queen is on b1, which is just horribly misplaced because this makes the coordination and the rook not able to make use of the b file. And so this is just a worse version. For example, king f1 and knight e4 is just very good. We will simply play f6 and break with c5 next. And so instead of queen b1, b takes a3 is for sure the best, and queen takes c3. And now white has two options. Both knight d2 and king f1 are playable, but as far as I see, knight d2 with best play leads to a draw. Quite a forcing one, but white has two options, or black has two options here. They can either play the move knight e4, which threatens knight takes d2, making use of the rook being weak or being loose, and after rook b1, queen a5 here, threatening knight c3, and it's really difficult to stop. But white has this amazing resource of this move bishop d3, and allowing this fork, but queen h5 comes, and this attack becomes really dangerous. For example, g6, queen h6, knight b1, we're up a full rook, and after the brilliant move castles, knight takes d2, now we're up a rook and a piece and a knight, but after bishop e5, this just threatens checkmate in 1, so f6 is forced, and this allows the sacrifice, something like this. And they can't ever take on f6, for example, because the king will simply run away to the queen side, and we're still up. We're actually now up 3 pieces. So this will lead to a draw with best play. Instead, c5 is also possible to try to keep chances alive. And after rook b1, c takes d4 is possible, but the line after rook b3 and queen c5 here, e takes d4, queen d4, and bishop d6 become really unclear. I think white is also better. I think they will eventually win an exchange. And so instead, I recommend this move c4. First off, preventing rook b3 and also preventing bishop d3. But still, I think white gets good play after bishop d6, attacking the rook. So rook e8 is important to prevent bishop e7. So for example, we don't want to allow this to damage our king side. So rook e8, castles, b6 here, preparing bishop d7 so that our b7 pawn is not hanging. But now g4. And let's say after bishop b7, g5, we stick a knight on e4, takes, and now this move queen e1. And this trades the queens, and allows, because possibly our queen wants to escape here with queen a5 to f5 or something, or even queen d5, and we're going to be quite happy there with nice control over the center, for example. And so queen e1 here trades the queens, but now we have a lot of weaknesses, and so white can take advantage of those weaknesses. Let's say after rook e d8, so we don't want to play a move like rook a d8, because this makes the rook on e8 just look stupid. For example, after bishop f4, what are our rooks doing, right? So instead, we play the move rook e d8 after bishop f4. Now we defend the pawn on c4, rook b5, and now knight c7. And in this forcing line after bishop takes c7, rook takes c7, white actually has some counterplay here with a4, a5. And the best line that I could figure out for black is just playing bishop a6, after rook e5, attacking the pawn, going back to b7, and we will end up with a repetition. If we try to play the move bishop c6, and rook b4, and bishop d5, white has counterplay with a5, and this ensures equality for the white pieces, because ba5, rook b5 is just equal. So in that sense, you have two options here to try to keep the game going with the move c5, which objectively is fine, or this move knight e4, which is tricky because white needs to know this variation with sacrificing the bishop, or sacrificing the bishop with the queen coming in, sacrificing a full rook and a piece. So I do recommend this variation actually, knight e4 over the move c5, because it's just a bit more tricky. And instead of knight d2, king f1 is also possible, and I do like this move b6. So we're just getting the pawn out of danger in case of rook b1. And let's say if we take on a3 here, this becomes a mess after h5, knight e4, and let's say h6. We just don't really want to allow the weakening of our king side like this. I just looked into this one variation, knight d2, e5, takes, rook d8, only moves to keep equality. So I don't really want to recommend that with a lot of memorization. But instead, b6 is very logical to make sure that the pawn is not in danger. And so now queen 6 a3 is an actual threat. So white should play the move bishop d6 to defend the pawn. After rook e8, bishop d3, and now c5. So now the threat is to shut down the bishop with the move c4, as we saw many times over. And so bishop e5 is the best move, threatening some discoveries. And so c4. And this actually forces white into sacrificing the bishop spectacularly with bishop takes h7, which leads to equality. Because if they drop the bishop back to e2, simply after knight e4, white just has no coordination. King is misplaced on f1. Bishop is bad on e2. Pawn on a3 will fall. White is just technically losing. And so bishop takes h7 is a necessary sacrifice, which leads to a draw with best play. After knight takes h7, knight g5. And so we see that the queen is actually coming in really quickly, and the rook is on the h file here. And so there are two variations here which are possible. We can either take on g5 and play knight c5. But the problem with this variation is that first off, queen h5 is not possible because we will simply take on a1, take both rooks, so we will end up with an extra piece and two rooks against the queen. So yeah, knight c5. But the problem again is that, as I mentioned with the errors before, is that there are so many moves here that need to be examined, such as king g1, rook h4, and bishop d6. So I don't think it's practical to walk into this. Instead, I recommend the immediate move knight c5, threatening knight e4, which plugs up the hole. And if we're able to plug up the hole, then we will just simply consolidate with the extra piece. And here, queen h5 is the only move. First off, threatening some stuff over here, but also sacrificing the rook. And here, after knight takes g5, queen takes g5 is key. If they play the move h takes g5, now here we will simply take, and as I mentioned before, we will be up a piece. Knight d7, bishop f4, and e5 is also very nice. Yeah, so we have two rooks for the queen, but also an extra knight. So that's that's easily winning. Instead, they have to play queen takes g5. Now threatening mate on g7, which forces f6, and rook e7, only defense. Bishop takes e7 and knight e4, hitting the queen with tempo. And now white has one final critical move to find. They have to find this move queen h5, which has the multi-purpose idea of threatening queen e8 with a perpetual, or queen d1 here. And so if they play the move queen g6, which you may ask is like, why isn't this the same? You can just like come back with the perpetual, right? But actually we have this move bishop d7, and now this becomes a big problem because now the rook is hanging, and we're covering the e8 square. And so we are I think we are just simply winning here because the king is just so exposed. So yeah, that's essentially this variation. And so queen h5 is by far the best move. The idea is that we cannot play bishop d7 now because the queen retreats to d1 and they consolidate everything. Our queen has no infiltration squares on d2 or c2. They're all covered, and we're just down an exchange and two pawns. So we don't want to allow this. And so after queen h5, we have to accept the rook and take the other rook and just allow this perpetual. So yeah, with best play, it is a draw again. But white needs to find all of those critical moves, such as queen takes g5, such as queen h5 here, sacrificing the rook, such as this bishop takes h7 move. Yeah, so that's the line that white needs to, the black needs to know, and also white, vice versa. And instead, bishop d3. Bishop d3 I think is more natural because you want to cover this e4 square, you're preventing knight e4, and you're sticking the bishop on the most natural square where you normally see the Jobava London bishop on, eyeing the king side. And so here, c5. It's important to only now to play c5 because we're actually threatening the move c4 to shut down this bishop. And so white cannot ignore it with a move like h5 because we will shut it down with c4. h6 is the best move. g6, closing down the position, bishop e2, and knight e4. Now we see this typical motif of making, of undermining this knight on c3 with the queen on a5. And after castles, now it's an important finesse here actually. Knight takes c3 is also good. After bc3, queen takes c3. e4 here is tries to undermine the pawn, and after de4, knight g5. Black is still better, but white makes use of the g5 square, and so I think there's actually an improvement here. For example, the best move here is f5, and after queen e1, this is a similar idea because if we trade off the queens, then we have a lot of weaknesses here. For example, the c4 pawn, our king is stuck to the defense of h7, so this gives white some counterplay. And so instead of that, we can actually first include this very nice move g5. And if they take on e4, after d4, yeah, now there are actually two pieces hanging here, so we will, I think, win a piece. For example, this, yeah, something like this. Queen 6 here, but we need to be careful of queen f5, so queen g4. So I'm not sure if queen f5 is good or something like that, but we will be up material here. And so instead, so we need to play g5 here, as I mentioned, and so bishop h2 is the best move, and only now do we take the pawn, because now we have ideas of knight b4 to c6, or also knight b8 to c6, and just improve this final piece. And so we see that if they play e4 now, we will simply take it, and there is no knight g5 move. So yeah, I think this is just an improved version. And we can also see that this h6 pawn is isolated and weak. So yeah, this covers this the reason why white cannot ignore this c4 advance. And if they play the move g4, now again we can play c4 and then play knight e4. So that's again a big problem for white. And so castling here is the best move, after which we can play the move knight b4, harassing the bishop. And let's say they just play a3, giving up the bishop, knight takes d3, cd3. Now we can take on d4 here, knight takes d4. And notice how after we take on d4 here, we can play on the c file, as we commonly know, bishop d7 followed by rook fc8. The most challenging variation here that I found is queen b3, attacking the b7 pawn. So queen a6 here, a defensive pawn. After knight cb5, rook ac8. So after this, knight c7. This leads to a forcing variation, which I will mention now, which is queen b6. And yeah, white is essentially forced to exchange off the queens, because possibly the move knight e8 will come, but we're also threatening the move queen takes b3 here, to misplace, to make sure that the knight is like behind the pawn, so the pawn cannot advance. Hopefully that makes some sense. Queen takes b6, a b6, and rook fc1. Looks quite natural. But now knight e8, and we're actually threatening something devious. For example, if they retreat with the knight to b5, saying that, oh, I've caused this weakness, let me just retreat with my knight. Actually, rook takes c1, rook c1, and bishop f6 is just already winning for black, because we have this threat of e5, and secondarily, there's a threat of e5, not just to fork the bishop and knight, but also to remove the defender of this knight on b5. And so this is just winning for black. And so h5 here is the best move, after which we will play again bishop f6, forcing the exchange of the knights. And after rook c7 here, we will simply trade. And now we can take over the center with e5, knight c3, knight f3, and b5. So now we're left with an interesting position where we have the two bishops and the nice center, more space, and also possible control over the c file. But we do have double pawns, so that's the factor that really doesn't give white an advantage. Doesn't give black an advantage. It only gives equality. If this pawn was back on a6, this would be like just a much better position. But with the pawn being doubled, the pawns being doubled on the b file, this is just an equal position. For example, this line that I found is bishop a5, e4, takes, knight d4, and rook c8. Black can simply play h6 next, possibly take on d4 if necessary, and then stick the bishop on c6 with a good position. This holds for sure. And so instead of a3 here, bishop e2 is also possible to preserve the bishop, but now we will solve the last problem in our position, which is the knight. So now it just retreats. And here, after it's possible to play knight b5 here, threatening some bishop c7 or knight c7 stuff, but now we will play c4 to shut down or disconnect the knight and its defender with the bishop on e2. And so a4 here tries to stick or maintain the knight on b5, but now we can play a6. And now if they play a move like knight c7, they've gone far too much into our territory. And after rook a7, there really is no defense against bishop d8. Yeah, it's really difficult to find a good move here for white with the knight being stranded there. Even just in the long term, if we don't win the knight will just be stranded on c7. So instead, bishop c7 is the only move. And now this forces b6. After knight d6, queen b4 was recommended by the computer, but I actually like this move rook a7, which attacks the bishop and forces knight takes c8. So I think it's less memorization. After rook takes c8, because it's more forcing, right? After bishop f4, c3 here, if they take on c3, they will just simply damage their structure. And so b3, knight e4, bishop d3, and f6 here is really nice to cover the e5 square. And this queen might look stranded here on a5, but it's actually doing quite a nice job with possibly knight b4 next. And if white ever takes on e4, then the queen will have access to the king side. So a g4 and knight b4, and I think black has no problems here. There's no attack, there's no knight e5 coming, black is doing good. So yeah, instead of knight b5, a3 is also possible. And here I recommend the move a6, now preventing any knight b5, any possibilities in knight b5. And here, knight e5 is, I don't really see a good move for white here. For example, dc5 just is met with queen takes c5. They can't even push b4 here. And so I don't see what is the, what white's trumps are in this position, because they can't push the pawn to c4. Instead, knight e5 is quite a thematic move, and after which we can take an e5, bishop takes e5, and knight d7. Now we're actually threatening to take the bishop off the board. And after bishop g3, I like this move queen d8, just consolidating. The queen has done its job on the queen side. Now that the king is castled, there's no more pressure on the knight. There's no need for the queen to be on a5. And after e4 here, which is the only critical move that I found, we can simply take on d4, play bishop c5, and after, let's say, queen d3, we can gain a lot of space with d4. And we're ready to actually play e5 next. So first off, if they play a move like knight e4 trying to attack our bishop, we can play b5, allowing this captures. But after, let's say, queen f3, bishop b7, there's a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. So I think black is doing very well. And instead of that, if they play the move b4, then we can simply secure the bishop back on a7, knight b1, and go for e5, where this bishop is just bad on g3. And so I'd be happy to enter this position for sure. So yeah, that essentially covers this this move, this main line of the Jobava London with this move knight b5 on the fourth move. And so the last variation is the big complex of the old Jobava London. So what was recommended by GingerGM and its chessable course. So d4, knight f6, let's say we can enter it through this move order, of course, knight c3, d5, bishop f4, e6, and now e3. So this is the old Jobava London system. And the problem with this variation is that bishop b4 is really annoying. And now we will simply continue with c5 next. But we need to be careful if we play c5 or if we don't play c5. So for example, against the sideline knight e2 here, preparing to capture on c3 with the knight, c5 doesn't make a lot of sense because after a3, we have to take on c3. If we retreat, they will simply take and push b4, winning a pawn. And so after c5 and a3, we have to take here and we concede the bishop pair without getting a lead in development. And there's already the threat of taking on c5 here. And so instead of playing c5 here, it's important to castle. And in case white plays the move a3, we can drop the bishop back to e7, followed by c5 next, with no issues at all. And rather, again, we see long term, this knight on c3 is misplaced, blocking the c-pawn from moving forward. So yeah, and if they play kind of like a passive or a waiting move here, passing move like h3 here, we can just continue with b6, followed by c5 next. So for example, g4, c5 here strikes really fast. And if they play a3, it's important that we included b6 here so that we can retreat with the bishop to a5 without running into the pawn on c5 hanging. And now we can simply play bishop a6 with a good position. This is really just too ambitious for to be good. And so instead of knight e2, if they play a3 now this illustrates the point of bishop e4 in that we can double the pawns and play c5. And it's important to know what happens if they blast open the center with c4, trying to undouble the pawns. And it's also important to know what happens after knight e2, just trying to maybe bring the knight to g3, develop, and castle. Here we can just play queen a5, putting some pressure on c3. And let's say after f3 here, b6 is really nice because we can play bishop a6 as well as knight c6 next with complete development, completely good position for black. Instead, if they play c4, now we can actually just take on d4. See, now they have only one good move here, which is e takes d4. Because if they play queen takes d4, knight c6 hits, and because our knight develops with tempo, and the bishop cannot come to b5 to pin our knight, we are just doing better here. And so e takes d4 is the only move, and now simple move knight c6. No, both knights toward the center, knight f3, and now castles. And now the important thing to know here is that if we want to wait for this bishop to develop out, and only then will we take. For example, if they play bishop d3, we will take on c4, develop the queen with tempo, queen e5 check. Let's say bishop d2, queen c7, the queen exerts some pressure on the c file, threatening the discovery with knight takes d4. So let's say queen e2, and now b6. We will develop the bishop to b7, put a rook on d8 and c8, and we can just see how this develops after castles, bishop e7, let's say bishop d3. The problem here for white is that if they push the pawn to c4, then this creates what's known as the hanging pawn structure, where the pawns will be possibly vulnerable to being attacked here, with the rooks coming to the open files and the knight coming to a5, giving black a good position. And otherwise, we can just bring the rook to d8 and still bring the rook to c8 with possible knight to a5, making use of the weakness on the c4 square, as well as we can prepare maybe some queen c6 to create a battery along the across the long diagonal. So that's the idea behind this setup. And if they play c3 here, we can actually develop our queen outwards, attacking the c3 pawn. And so rook c1 seems natural, but this makes the a3 pawn weak. And it's actually useful here not to take the pawn immediately, because we can see that this becomes a long-term weakness. For example, if we take on a3, white can play c5 here. And for example, after knight e4, bishop d3, this becomes quite scary because there might be some Greek sacrifices with knight g5 coming. So I kind of want to avoid that. And so bishop d7 here is a really useful move. Let's say if they play c takes d5, we can now play e takes d5, controlling the c4 square. The pawn a3 is weak, so now we can capture it. And just long term, this is going to be a very difficult position for white. So yeah, that's essentially this variation with a3. And instead, the last move is bishop d3, after which now we can play c5, noting that if they play a3, since the knight is not on e2, we can damage the structure, play queen e5, and if they play the very the natural looking move queen d2, then we can kick the bishop back and actually play the move knight e4, we're just winning the pawn on c3 and even the whole house. Yeah, everything falls apart here. So yeah, they cannot play the move a3 here, and so they have to play d takes c5, removing the possibility of c4. And here we don't want to take on c5 because we can simply develop another piece, knight b d7, and actually we can also think about pushing this pawn to e5 if allowed. For example, in the variation after knight e2, we may want to keep the option alive of e5, and so we don't want to take on c5 immediately. So after dc5, knight b d7, there are two moves here. They can play the move knight f3, which is Naroditsky's preferred move when he does play this variation, or the move knight e2, which prepares to capture on c3 with the knight in case we take. And let's cover knight f3 first. And in this position, we can either play the move knight takes c5, or bishop takes c3 immediately, and it really just transposes. So let's look at the most forcing way, which is bishop takes c3, bc3, and knight takes c5. Now it's important to know what happens if they challenge our center with c4, or just castle, which is what Naroditsky played or plays. If we go for c4, we can simply ignore it and just castle. Let's say the idea behind white's c4 move is to eventually undouble the pawns, right? So it makes a lot of sense to take on d5. But now we will take on d5 with the knight, attacking the bishop e5 in f6, and now we will simply build an impressive center with the move e5 next. For example, bishop d4, we can take the bishop, c takes d3, and push e5. And we see that the bishop is coming to e6. We have some queen a5 checks available. Let's say bishop b2, queen b6 here, harassing the bishop. Queen b3, yeah, just trying to get the queens off the board and attacking the knight. But we have this queen a5 move. Yeah, and now the king has to move, or the knight has to block on d2. And so king e2 makes some sense, and now bishop e6, threatening some discovery against the queen. And after queen a3, now again we don't want to trade the queen, so we play queen b5 with some threats of knight b4 possibly, followed by a5. Yeah, and maybe using this the possibility of the e4 push, making use of this pin on the pawn. And so rook h to b1 is the only move that I see trying to prevent knight b4. And after that, we can simply retreat with the queen to d7. And I see that we have a small majority on the queen side here, which we can advance to a5. We have the possibility of bishop g4, pinning the knight, and so forcing the king to stay on e2, so that it does not damage the pawn structure. And yeah, we just can slowly burn this position. Even though material is equal, our position is just much better. The computer evaluates this as approximately minus 2.5. So yeah, that's if they play c4. Just remember, just ignore it and allow the c takes d5. And if they play castles, and after castles, there are two moves in this position. Naroditsky has played knight e5 7 times, and this is actually a really bad move. But most of his opponents have never found their refutation. And the idea is that actually this pawn on c3 is quite weak, and this knight on e5 is actually not stable. Because after we play the move knight fe4, attacking the pawn on c3, we also introduce this possibility of playing f6. And so if they play queen e1, which looks like it defends the pawn, we actually play f6. And after the knight retreats to f3, e5. And this just wins a piece, actually. Because after, let's say, bishop comes back to g3, we take the bishop, and we push e4 with a fork. So that's just winning. So instead of queen e1, bishop takes e4 is the best move. But now we play knight takes e4, attacking the pawn on c3. And the best line, according to the computer, is just giving up the pawn. But after queen a5, followed by the knight coming to a4 back, retreating, kicking the knight back to with f6, followed by b6 and possibly bishop e6. Black's pieces just come to life. Black has a nice center, and black is just technically winning with an extra pawn. So instead, c4 looks quite logical, try to undouble the pawns, but now we play f6. And the problem is that now the knight will be kicked back, and now we can take on c4 nicely. Okay, we can take on c4, but we can also include this e5 move first, with hitting the bishop with the tempo. So bishop g3, now we take the pawn, queen e2, and bishop e6 with a clean extra pawn, completely winning. Bishop is just bad on g3. So yeah, c4, yeah, f6 is just good. So instead of knight e5, which has been played by Naroditsky a lot of times, this move bishop g5 is just much better, which was played 5 times actually. And there are 2 moves here. I think a very simple approach is just to play h6, and after the bishop retreats, because they don't want to give up the bishop pair, we can simply play knight cd7, just defending the knight, breaking the pin, and we want to follow with b6 and bishop b7 next, possibly queen c7 to put pressure on the c-file. Let's say c4, we can take on c4, bishop takes c4. So we see that we only take now because there's a threat of white taking on d5 and forcing us to get an isolated pawn. So we don't want to allow that, so we take on c4, play b6, followed by bishop b7 with a fine position. We can see that black is just slightly better because the weakness of the structure here with 3 pawn islands for white. And so instead of that, the more maximalistic approach is to play knight ce4, attacking the bishop. And if they retreat with the bishop to h4, after queen c7, the c3 pawn simply falls because there's too much pressure on it. And so they have to take on e4 here. After d takes e4, they can either retreat with the knight to d2, or trade off the queens and then play knight d2 or knight d4, or knight d4 specifically. If they play knight d2 immediately, we can play this move e5. And due to tactics, they, for example, if they take on f6, take on e4, we just play queen g6, or yeah, which looks very good, or even just queen c6 here. I think, yeah, bishop f5 coming, c3 weak, everything is just falling, I think. And so c4 here is best, but now we can defend the pawn with bishop f5. After rook b1, b6, white can try to gain some counterplay against the center, but now queen d6 holds everything together. And like the best line for white according to the computer is f4, e takes f3, bishop takes f6, queen f6, queen takes f3, and bishop takes c2. So at the end of the day, white is active, but they have severe structural weaknesses. Even if they win the pawn back, white will still be worse because of the structural weakness and black having the bishop against the knight in an endgame. So this is just good for black. And instead, if they trade off the queens here and then play rook fd1, trying to make use of the back rank, we can trade off the rooks. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1, knight d5. And the forcing line continues after c4. We take here, they take on d5, e5, g takes f3, and bishop e6. So now we just have a better structure. If they ever play rook b1, we can play b6, and we can just slowly harass the pawn, the c2 and a2 pawn with rook c8, activate the king. Yeah, we just have a better structure here. So that's quite a nice position. And that's the maximalist approach. So yeah, that's after knight f3. The other move we need to look at is knight e2, which doesn't allow the us to break the structure. But now I like this move a6, which covers the b5 square, and now we're actually threatening something sneaky. So the idea is that we are actually threatening e5 followed by e4, which traps the bishop. And so because the knight is on e2, we need to notice that this bishop on d3 is vulnerable to being won with this trap. If we play the move knight takes c5 now, they can play a3, forcing us to give up the bishop. And this does not damage the pawn structure, which is a problem because the knight is now on e2. So if we take on d3 and play something like bishop d6, then they can take and play e4, giving us an isolated pawn on d5. So white is just better there. So instead, if we play this move a6, and white plays a3 here, we can take on c5 now. So this is what happened in my game against this national master, a very high rated person. And here he actually blundered the trap, which is after castles. I play e5, and simply I play e4 and just win a piece. Knight takes d5 was played, and I just simply take the piece, queen takes d3, and now I need to figure out some way of breaking this pin. So I simply play bishop e7, threatening a knight takes d5 to trade some pieces. So they just take on e7, but after this, knight d4 was chosen in the game, threatening knight f5, which is a decent try, but after knight e5, yeah, there's simply nothing here. I just consolidated, castled, and won a very nice game. So yeah, that's a trap that white can fall into. But instead, bishop g3 is the best move. And here, knight h5 was recommended, I think, by Sam Shankland, with just winning the bishop pair. But I also like just a simple approach of castling, knight d4, and playing rook e8. And now there are some additional possibilities of pushing the pawn to e5. We can also play b5 and bishop b7, solving the problem of our bishop here, which is, yeah, generally like the biggest problem in this variation for black. And also we can drop the bishop back to f8 to secure the king side. So I think black is doing very well in this variation. So yeah, that essentially covers this entire variation of the Jobava London system after the move e6. We've covered knight b5 and we've covered the move e3. And I think e3 is just a bad variation nowadays. And so knight b5 is definitely what you will face most often against serious players. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, please comment those down below. If you have any suggestions for future videos, if you like the video, please like it and subscribe. So thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.